Drugs. Another category of why I think we need a criminal justice reform is just simply the issue with drugs. Currently, the snapshot for our city is that drugs are is basically what's driving specifically aggravated assaults and burglary property crimes in the city of Wichita. Um, in a recent interview with the Deputy Chief Jose Salcedo with the Wichita Police Department, he discussed how methamphetamines is the drug that is creating a lot of the problems for the community as it relates to crimes. And, in a recent interview with Sheriff Easter, he also discussed that 73% of inmates in the Sedgwick County Jail deal with substance abuse. Um, and drug addicts drive and are driving most of the property crime. And another recent article uh, that I was found through Cake TV, the city of Wichita reported that there has been over $500,000 in damages in city-owned properties where criminals are coming in and stealing the copper wire. In an interview with the Cake, Sergeant McDonald with the Wichita Police Department Property Crime Section talked about how the issue currently with these property crimes is that the price of precious metal has gone up, and people with their addictions are looking to get a quick fix, so they will go out and commit property crimes. And some of those property crimes include obtaining copper wire from electricity poles or utility poles throughout the city. So the city itself have seen over $500,000 in damages, as well as communities and as well as organizations like Westar and Cox Communications, where they have also seen upwards of $100,000 in damages. Again, driven by people who are addicted to drugs and are in and out of jail. There's an estimated 68% and this is a statistics that I found very interesting, was 68% of prisoners that are released were arrested within 3 years. 79% were arrested within 6 years, and 83% were arrested within 9 years. And this is according to statistics from a study that was done over a 9-year period by the Department of Justice. And not to mention the cycle of mental illness between the law enforcement community, the medical community, and the local jails. And the reason I bring this point up is because just my own personal experience in working in this field, um, over and over we see the cycle of where law enforcement is called to the scene because someone is either running in and out of the streets, is talking to themselves, is acting bizarre, so the community calls concern of that individual. Law enforcement shows up. It's not illegal to be under the influence of drugs, and it's not illegal to have a mental health crisis. So at that point, law enforcement's response and policies are that you will respond to assist and assess the mental crisis situation. Therefore, that's why the Wichita Police Department has already trained upwards of 150 officers in that are CIT, critical incident team, which is officers that specifically deal with individuals that are having a mental health crisis. And those officers respond, and really their hands are tied, so the only option is to refer them to the medical community. A lot of times EMS will get called and will transport them to the local hospital like St. Joseph, who's also has a ward built in within the hospital. And then eventually that person is having a mental crisis along with being under the influence of some sort of drugs. After the drugs wear out, the medical community or the hospitals will then release the individuals. They have nowhere to go. They're homeless, and they want to get their next high. And they start coming off their high, which then creates a psychosis. And a lot of times I've noticed that the hospitals then call law enforcement once again because they want them off their property and want them trespassed from the property unless they're having a medical emergency. Then that triggers the other problem which eventually this individual will do something that will commit a crime, whether it's trespassing or a battery of a person or security guard at the hospital, and then eventually that person will end up back in jail. And it's a vicious cycle. And we're not addressing the real issue, which is addiction and mental health. I think when it comes to mental health, we need to do something more. Recently, there was a facility that is parallel to CompCare where people that are suffering from substance abuse can go there, where they can wear off the high, where if they are under the influence of alcohol or drugs, they can go there. They'll be supervised, and then they'll be offered substance abuse programs. However, this just started a few years ago, and then routinely the only two places was St. Joseph Hospital and CompCare, and that in no way is really addressing the issue, because when it comes to law enforcement, they're normally the ones that respond to these types of situations, and their response is to train to refer to the medical facilities, but really there's only so much you can do. So a lot of this responsibility falls on law enforcement, and eventually those individuals end up in jail, and they do not belong in jail. People with mental illness should not be in jail, and that is why I firmly believe in criminal justice reform. To wrap it up, as I was doing research, consideration in a recent study, 2017, there's a study of first-time offenders who were referred to mental health providers, and they basically noticed that in regards to recidivism rates were actually lower, and they lasted longer periods of time. And it's amazing to me that this concept and this study, which I think should be applied to the juvenile offenders in regards to the reform, not only for criminal justice, but also the criminal justice for young offenders, which is why we need more programs such as Real Men, Real Heroes, Boys and Girls Club, and different organizations. And another recent article that I read, the Wichita Police Department had been partnering up with the YMCA, and that they had an after-school program where they were offering kids just a place to go, a safe place where they weren't being influenced by gangs, they weren't being influenced by drugs, they weren't being offered drugs, and it was in a supervised environment where they can play, they can stay up late, up until curfew, and law enforcement were present to where they can interact with law enforcement officers. And lastly, I want to wrap up with this. Growing up in California and Inglewood during the 1990s, which was when the riots were happening, I remember living in a disorganized neighborhood. My daily walk was in elementary and middle school. My daily walk consisted of knowing the paths, what to take, because you were either going to be confronted by a gang member, you were going to be confronted and offered drugs, or you had the chance of observing or being a witness to a crime or being a victim of a crime. So I firmly believe that disorganized neighborhoods do have a play and an influence in a juvenile's life, especially if the parent's efficiency is not one that shows love and care and support for their children. And as we learned through this semester, there's going to be an increase in the chances of a juvenile to go to end up in prison, especially if they have a parent who is in jail, or they have a relative who's in jail, or they have both parents who's in jail, or they have parents who are under use or under the influence of drugs. I had one case, 14-year-old, from the area where I was patrolling, encountered a 14-year-old Hispanic male. Mom was addicted to drugs and routinely would be in and out of relationships with random men. And it was a broken home where they were poor, and the gang started to have an influence on this juvenile. Within a 1-year period, The juvenile was holding guns, drugs, and money for the gang, and was convinced to commit a armed robbery. Um, he ended up being arrested for the armed robbery, along with other members of the gang. And what caught my attention is that the juveniles that committed the armed robbery were between the ages of 14 and 16, and the one influencing the kids was 19 years old. So I think there needs to be a drastic change. We need to have more programs. We need to have more mental health programs. We need to have more resources provided for our youth. There needs to be a complete change in the criminal justice reform. We're not going to arrest ourselves out of this